Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be a brief talk about botanic gardens, what they are and why they matter to this conference. And many of you may imagine botanic gardens to be beautiful gardens full of plants, plant diversity, which of course is true, but I wanted to try and tell you about the extra dimensions of botanic garden you might not be so familiar with. But I wanted to step back a bit before I start, which is to talk very briefly about why any of us should care about nature. Now, this conference is about climate change, and I want to talk a little bit about nature, but of course they're inextricably interwoven. And I'm often asked, why should we care about nature? Why should we care about the plants, the animals, the fungi, the microorganisms on this planet? And I think, put simply, there's three very good answers to that. And the first is purely utilitarian, self-interest. Professor Dasgupta, who is here today and did the work for the British government, an extremely important report on the economics of biodiversity, the value of biodiversity. His work estimates that about 40% of global GDP is entirely dependent upon nature. So if we have no other reason at all for caring for nature, let's think about the economic value of it. But there are other reasons as well. The second, I would argue, is a moral issue. There's an estimated 8 billion species on this planet, probably many more, but an estimated 8 million, particularly if you include all the microorganisms. But there is only one species that's causing the trouble, and it is, of course, ours. The so-called thinking man is causing the problem. Nature would do fine without us. We are the cause of the problem. And therefore, I believe that we have a moral obligation. We have become, as the writer Mark Linus has put it, the God species. The rest of nature is in our hands, and I think that confers an enormous responsibility on us to protect those other 8 million species on this planet. And finally, I think there's a humanitarian argument. If we're only interested in our own species, think of your children, their children, etc. And Jonas Salk, this is a wonderful quote, he invented the polio vaccine back in the 20th century, and he said our first responsibility as humanity is to be a good ancestor. And I think we're not doing a very good job on that at the moment. So those are the three reasons, I think, as a foundation to this talk, why we should care about nature at all. The utilitarian, the moral, and the humanitarian. So then you think, well, what's going on in the world? What's the context in which a botanic garden works? And at Kew, we've done a lot of thinking about this. And in essence, the headline is very, very simple. I think there are two existential defining challenges for humanity in the 21st century. And I'm going to try and convince you that botanic gardens are operating at the very crosswires of these two challenges. The first, of course, is the fundamental purpose of this entire endeavor that we are part of this week, which is the climate crisis. I'm speaking to the converted, of course, but there is no individual, there is no society, there is no country in the world that will not be affected in some way by the climate crisis. It is current, it is real. There is the first climate-induced famine underway in Madagascar, where 1 million people are now going short of food. And we've seen the news coverage, the fires in Greece or Australia, the peak temperatures, the bizarre temperatures in British Columbia. So it's not just developing or less affluent countries that are affected. It is affluent and temperate countries too. So the climate crisis is amongst us, and the only question is how bad it gets and what we do about it. And the other challenge, of course, is the biodiversity crisis, or actually, to use a more direct language, the extinction crisis. And science has done amazing work on this. The evidence is now very clear. Our generation is witnessing and causing an extinction crisis. The science suggests that the current rate of biodiversity loss, i.e. extinction, the permanent loss of a species, is somewhere between 100 and 1,000-fold the pre-human rate. That is extraordinary and deeply concerning. Kew's own work has suggested that up to 40% of all the known plant species on this planet, and we know of about 380,000 species of higher plants. So a higher plant is a plant that has internal plumbing. It doesn't include mosses or lichens or algae. Our work estimates that 40% of all higher plants are threatened with extinction in this century unless we change the way we're treating our planet. And of course, increasingly bodies, including the UN, have started to treat these two crises as two sides of the same coin. The UN estimates that climate change is now the third main cause of biodiversity loss. Perhaps the most stark example is the degradation of the Great Barrier Reef caused by acidification and rising temperatures. But examples abound everywhere. Fires, of course, are another example, the acidification of the oceans, etc. So it's currently believed to be the third main cause of biodiversity loss, but it's also believed to be the principal cause of biodiversity loss, again, unless we manage to tackle climate change. And the opposite is also true. Robust and resilient ecosystems can be our friends in addressing climate change. They draw down carbon, they store water, they mitigate temperature. But of course, degradation of environment and ecosystems also releases greenhouse gases. The loss of tropical forests, for instance, is one of the principal sources of greenhouse gas emissions globally, far bigger, for instance, than global aviation. So these two problems are interwoven, and I was encouraged when earlier this year the UN published a report which for the first time treated these two problems in the same report as two sides of the same coin. And that, in a nutshell, is why Q is here today in our display downstairs. We want to try and illustrate and to bang the drum for nature-based solutions, the role that nature can play, not just in mitigating climate, but of course enhancing biodiversity. So we did a lot of work earlier this year at Q thinking about our long-term purpose, and in a sense it's very, very simple. We want to try and align everything we do at Q to address the two global challenges of biodiversity loss and climate change. Now, at this point you may be thinking, well, what is a botanic garden? A botanic garden is just a garden, isn't it? How can a botanic garden help? A botanic garden is a garden. We have a beautiful garden at Kew. It's a World Heritage Site. It has nearly 17,000 different species of plants there, which the Guinness Book of Records says is the most diverse collection of plants in the world. We have a second site down in Sussex. We refer to it as our country garden, 560 acres, ancient woodland, grasslands, wetlands, etc. But a botanic garden is more than just a garden. And many other of the world's leading botanic gardens would say the same thing. New York, Missouri, Singapore, beautiful botanic gardens all around the world. In addition to a garden that is a collection of wild plant diversity, we tend to employ scientists who work on plant science and conservation all around the world. So at Kew, for instance, we have about 350 scientists working all around the world, including a permanent research base in Madagascar, which, by the way, is believed by the UN to be the country most affected by climate change. We undertake education. We have about 120,000 school children visiting Kew. Our aim, of course, is to inspire them with the natural world and to inspire them with science and the scientific approach. And we also get involved with government policy, the provision of data and evidence. So these are important themes for us as a botanic garden. And underpinning all of this are our collections. It's a bit jargony, but we're a collections-based institution. I've mentioned, for instance, the nearly 17,000 species of living plants, but we have an enormous collection of dried plant specimens called a herbarium, 7.5 million species collected over about 170 years from every tropical country in the world. We have microscope slides, we have DNA, we have a seed bank, we have an extraordinary archive and collection of botanical art. And you may be thinking, well, so what? But these collections, they represent knowledge. They represent knowledge of plant and fungal diversity globally and back in time. What was the flora of Sri Lanka, say, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago? If you wanted to answer that question and understand how it has changed, you would turn to a herbarium, an institution like Kew, to understand the diversity of life, plant life on Earth, and how it has changed. So think of our collections as knowledge which can be applied to develop solutions. So, we've aligned everything we're trying to do at Kew towards these two global challenges of climate change and the extinction crisis. And specifically, we've alighted upon 5 things. And I'll mention all 5, but then I'll give some examples of the first of them, which is the most important to us. So the first of the 5 things that we at Kew are trying to do, and you would hear a very, very similar thing if you had the director of New York Botanic Gardens sitting here, or the director of Singapore Botanic Gardens, for instance. The first thing we're trying to do is science-based solutions to those challenges I mentioned. So what does that mean in practice? It means, for example, discovering climate-resilient crops. It means, for example, providing the metrics and the data to allow a country, such as Colombia or Costa Rica, to actually understand the diversity of plants they have and whether it is getting better or worse. So to give one example, we worked with the Cameroonian government to look at the diversity of plants in an area of extraordinary floristic richness called the Igbo Forest. The Igbo Forest is famous for various things, including the chimpanzees who use tools to crack open nuts, where chimpanzees have been observed using tools. but floristically, it's incredibly rich as well, with endangered and endemic plants, so plants only found in that region. And Kew's work, in a sense, was very simple. We provided the evidence to the Cameroonian government to say, look, this area is really special. This area merits protection. There was lobbying some global superstars as well, like Leonardo DiCaprio, but that evidence helped persuade the Cameroonian government to protect that area of forest, and it is today protected. So the provision of evidence, or knowledge if you like, can help inform decisions. The second thing we're trying to do is to inspire people to care. And I think that's incredibly important. And we can do that through visits to our gardens, we can do it through digital, through broadcasting, and through publishing. The most powerful way of doing it is to visit our gardens. And if you were to visit our gardens today, you would see more and more messages, including about this conference, COP26, which relate to contemporary issues in plant science and conservation, about seed banking, about climate resilient crops, about habitat restoration, about the link between climate change and biodiversity. So we want to use a visit to Kew as an educational but also an inspirational experience. And my view is that if you just come to Kew Gardens and you enjoy the rose garden, you have a cup of tea and you have a picnic with your family, we have failed. You can do all of those things and I hope you enjoy them, but you should leave knowing something about the natural world, the challenges that it faces and the importance of the natural world that you did not have in your head when you arrived. And that should be the case even if you're a member and you visit every week of your life. So it should be an educational and an inspiring experience. The third thing we're trying to do is to train the next generation. We train horticulturalists in botanical horticulture. They can identify plants, they can germinate plants, including plants that are very difficult to grow. And of course, if you can't germinate plants, you can't protect them. But we also train scientists. We have more than 100 MSc and PhD students working at Kew, affiliated with universities all around the world. And that's a number we want to grow very materially. We've got a notional figure of tripling that in the next decade. And ideally, these will be people from all of the most tropically biodiverse countries in the world: Peru, Indonesia, Madagascar, Mexico, coming to Kew to study and then returning to their countries to do good work. The fourth thing we're trying to do is to broaden our reach. It's self-evident, really. We're a public body, we're a charity, and the more people we can engage, that's why we're here at COP, the more impact we can have. And the fifth thing, and I've mentioned this already, is about the provision of evidence and expertise and advice to our own government. We're an arm's length body of DEFRA, but also supranational bodies like the UN, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, like the Convention on the Illegal Trade of Wildlife, to provide evidence and advice to enable them to make better decisions, make better policies, and enforce policies through the application of evidence and data. So those are the 5 things that I think a Botanic Garden, certainly the 5 things that Kew is trying to do. Science-based solutions inspire the public to care, train experts, broaden our reach, and help governments make better decisions through advice and expertise. And all that may sound a bit arid, but I'll just give you a few examples that hopefully bring it to life. And they're all going to focus on the first, which is science-based solutions. So one of the projects Kew runs is called the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership. And it's a wonderfully simple idea, which is that we work in partnership with about 120 countries around the world to gather the seeds of endangered plants. They are collected, they are desiccated, and they are frozen at -20 degrees centigrade. Typically, they're frozen in an in-country facility and separately at our facility at Kew. It's actually our second site just south of London. We've now banked about 40,000 species. And think of this in 2 ways. Firstly, most simply, this is an insurance policy against extinction. These plants will never go extinct. They are secure regardless of what happens in situ. Secondly, think of it as a gene bank. It's the most extraordinary repository of genomic information. So when scientists at Cambridge University were looking at a new strain of rice that was much less water thirsty, we could provide the relevant wild relatives, the genes of the wild relatives. We worked with the Norwegian government over the best part of a decade to collect all the wild relatives of the 29 most important crop plants, so banana, millet, barley, wheat, rice, all around the world. Because again, those wild relatives will have attributes like pest resilience, peak temperature, aridity tolerance, etc., that perhaps has been bred out of the crops that feed the world because we focused obviously on yield over the past 10,000 years of plant domestication. And it's a striking fact, many of you may know this, according to the FAO, they estimate that 50% of all global human calories come from just 3 plants: maize, rice, and wheat. But we know at least 7,000 are edible. And so the challenge here is that we are dangerously reliant on a terribly slender thread of genetic diversity at a time of growing population, particularly in Africa, and at a time of climate change. So the wild relatives of these plants may have attributes that can help maintain these incredibly important crops. And that was one of the case studies I wanted to mention. Is Kew's done a lot of work on coffee. Now, coffee isn't essential for nutrition, but I think you'll all agree it's pretty essential. There's very good coffee there if anyone needs a coffee after this talk. It is, in fact, the world's most valuable plant crop. Estimates vary, but the global trade in coffee is somewhere between 90 billion and 120 billion per annum. In a country like Ethiopia, which is the historic home of Arabica, somewhere between 20 and 25% of all livelihoods depend on the coffee trade, farming, processing it, etc. And coffee is unusual because it tends to be lots of smallholders rather than like corn, for instance, which is done at huge scale with relatively large organizations. But coffee traditionally comes from the cool hills of Uganda, north of 1,000 meters, and it is struggling in many parts of the world with peak temperature. In Thailand, for instance, Vietnam, Brazil, the coffee crop, Arabica, is starting to struggle because of the peak temperature. And yet it's valuable and many lives depend on it. The work that Kew's been doing is to look at the wild relatives of coffee to see, well, are there variants out there that can cope with peak temperature? And there's about 140 different species of coffee known, even though only 2 are grown currently commercially at any scale. And one of the interesting things about this is when I graduated from university, and I'm not that old, we knew about 50 species of coffee. And I say that just to give a sense of how quickly our knowledge of plant diversity is increasing. So we've tripled our knowledge of the diversity of wild coffee species in the last 30 years. And yet coffee is the world's most valuable plant. So that indicates how little we know about something that is of great value to humanity. Kew scientists knew about a plant that used to be grown commercially, believed to have the most exceptional flavor. It was grown back about 100, 120 years ago. It was called Stenophila. They stopped growing it simply because the yield of Arabica was better, but the flavor of Stenophila was believed to be better. The great thing about Stenophila was it grew at sea level. They knew it could cope with peak temperatures at least 6 degrees higher than Arabica, which is the coffee that you'll get just over there. So the hunt was on. Where did it go? Why is it no longer grown? Does anyone have any living Stenophila plants? And no one could find any anywhere. We went to Kew's collections, and the last known recorded specimen of Stenophila was found in Sierra Leone in the 1950s. And the herbarium specimen confirmed it was Stenophila. We could look at the genomics of the specimen and compare them with the commercial crop. We had Stenophila seeds harvested from the 1920s. So we knew it was the right plant, and the specimen told us where it was last found in the 1950s. Kew worked with their partners to conduct plant hunting expeditions. They went to this forest and they found one plant surviving. But just like humans, one plant is no good. You can't breed it. But our local partners, and this is key, the local knowledge was key. They said, well, this forest is pretty similar to one I know, a little bit down the road. And a year later, they went to that other forest. They found other Stenophila plants. They're now being bred. There's 6,000 in commercial cultivation. And in blind tasting of Stenophila coffee, it was superior to Arabica. And it can cope with 6 degrees higher temperature. So it's a case study. It's a good case study because everyone likes coffee, but it's a case study of how knowledge of where plants are and their attributes, in this case, their ability to cope with peak temperature, can be incredibly valuable. And in this case, as I say, the world's most valuable plant product. The last story I'll mention briefly is a banana. It's a wild banana. We are very familiar with bananas. They've been bred asexually. They're all identical, and they have no pips, of course, so they can't reproduce sexually, and you don't want pips in your banana. Wild bananas tend to be inedible with very large, hard pips. And there's a particular banana in Ethiopia called Enset, big plant. And the bananas, the fruits themselves, are not eaten, but what is eaten is the stalk and the corm. There's a big corm underground, and it's a great reserve of carbohydrate. And the great thing about this plant is it survives when others fail. So if the barley or the teff harvest in Ethiopia fails because of aridity or peak temperatures, the Enset survives. And in the areas of Ethiopia that grew Enset back in the 1980s when there was the terrible drought, those areas did not suffer famine. So it's known as a hunger crop. And it can stay in the ground until it's needed. It doesn't have to be harvested at the end of the season. So Cure's been working with our partners in Addis Ababa to understand the genomics of this, the different cultivars, and which variants are most suited to current and future climate predictions, which ones give the best yield and the best nutritional profile. And the interesting thing about this is there's an estimated 25 million people in Ethiopia that rely in part on this plant for nutrition. But if you go 1,000 kilometers to the south, to Tanzania, the plant grows completely wild and natural, but they simply were not aware in Tanzania that it's used for nutrition. And I had a very first-hand experience of this, which surprised me. Cure's worked in Tanzania for 100 years, and I was on a seed collecting trip there with the regional director of the Tanzanian Forestry Service, whose knowledge of local plants, trees in particular, was extraordinary. And I found myself in the peculiar position of me telling him about this particular tree. This banana tree, and he simply had no idea that in Ethiopia this was a source of food. It grows wild and naturally in Tanzania. So there's a bigger question here as whether the sharing of knowledge across, in this case, East Africa can help to address climate-induced food insecurity. So there's a few case studies, the Millennium Seed Bank, the coffee, and the wild banana. And I focused on science in this talk because I think that's the theme of this conference. But they are examples of how I believe a botanic garden, with our combination of our international relationships, our knowledge of plant diversity and plant science, and our willingness to work with organizations all around the world to share this knowledge and to protect and to research wild plant diversity, really can help to save the world. Our final line, which we rather like, is that botany is the science that will save humanity, and our future is botanic. And botany, I think, as a word, it has a wonderfully gentle, almost Victorian feel. And our job at Kew is to infuse it with a contemporary urgency and relevance. So we've come up with this line that are on all our posters downstairs if you come and visit. Our future is botanic, which I hope I'm talking to the converted. I hope you agree our future is indeed botanic, because at its simplest, all life depends on plants. Thank you. Do we do a question? Does anyone have a question? No questions. Okay, thank you.